Welcome to the Sleep Scholar. Tonight, we'll explore a quiet corner of history together. Settle in, close your eyes, and let these gentle facts carry you into deep sleep. The 19th century represented a pivotal era in maritime history, spanning from 1800 to 1899, during which sailing ships dominated global commerce and transportation for the first half of the century, before gradually yielding to steam-powered vessels. During this transformative period, life aboard sailing vessels remained largely unchanged from previous centuries, with sailors continuing to face the same fundamental challenges of wind, weather, and the vast expanses of ocean that had confronted mariners for generations before them. The daily existence of a 19th century sailor was characterized by routine hardship, strict hierarchical discipline, and the constant awareness that one's survival depended entirely upon the collective efforts of the crew and the seaworthiness of their wooden vessel. Maritime commerce in the early 1800s was dominated by what historians refer to as the Age of Sail, when wind-powered ships carried approximately 90% of all international trade. Records from the British Admiralty indicate that in 1805, the Royal Navy alone employed over 140,000 sailors across more than 600 vessels of various sizes and classifications. The merchant marine fleets of major maritime nations, including Britain, the United States, France, and the Netherlands, collectively employed hundreds of thousands of additional sailors who worked aboard trading vessels, whaling ships, and passenger carriers that connected distant continents through established sea routes. The transition from sail to steam power began gradually in the 1820s and 1830s, with early steamships primarily serving coastal routes and river transportation. It is said that the first regular transatlantic steamship service commenced in 1838, when the Great Western crossed from Bristol to New York in 15 days. Though sailing ships continued to dominate long-distance ocean travel for several more decades due to their greater cargo capacity and lower operating costs. The typical sailing ship of the early 19th century was a complex wooden structure requiring constant maintenance and skilled seamanship to operate effectively. Most merchant vessels of this period were three-masted ships rigged with square sails, measuring between 100 and 200 feet in length, and capable of carrying cargo loads ranging from 200 to 1,500 tons. Naval vessels were generally larger and more heavily armed, with ships of the line often exceeding 200 feet in length and carrying crews of 600 to 800 men. The largest merchant sailing ships, known as East Indiamen, could reach lengths of nearly 200 feet and required crews of approximately 120 to 150 sailors to manage their extensive sail systems and cargo operations. Sailors during this era came from diverse backgrounds, though the majority were drawn from coastal communities where maritime traditions had been established over generations. Port cities such as Portsmouth, Plymouth, Liverpool, Boston, New York, and Hamburg served as major recruiting centers where young men, typically between the ages of 14 and 25, would sign articles of agreement for voyages lasting anywhere from several months to 3 years or more. Records from the period indicate that approximately 60% of sailors were literate, a rate slightly higher than the general population, though their education was often limited to basic reading and mathematical skills necessary for navigation and commerce. The social composition of ship crews followed a rigid hierarchy that had evolved over centuries of maritime tradition. At the top of this structure was the captain, who held absolute authority over all aspects of ship operations and crew discipline. Below the captain were the ship's officers, including the first mate, second mate, and various specialists such as the boatswain, carpenter, cook, and sailmaker. The ordinary seamen, who comprised the majority of any crew, were responsible for the daily tasks of sailing, maintenance, and cargo handling under the supervision of their officers. Navigation during the 19th century relied primarily on traditional methods that had been refined over previous centuries, though significant technological improvements were introduced throughout the period. Most ships carried chronometers, which had become more reliable and affordable following the innovations of John Harrison in the previous century, allowing for more accurate determination of longitude at sea. The sextant, perfected in the 1700s, remained the primary instrument for celestial navigation, enabling skilled navigators to determine their position by measuring the angles between celestial bodies and the horizon. Charts and nautical almanacs provided essential information about coastlines, water depths, currents, and astronomical data necessary for safe passage across familiar and unfamiliar waters. The daily routine aboard sailing ships was governed by the watch system, typically organized into 4-hour periods, during which specific groups of sailors were responsible for managing the vessel while others rested. The ship's bell marked these watches, striking once for each half-hour that had passed since the beginning of the watch, creating a rhythmic pattern that structured life at sea. During their assigned watches, sailors performed various duties, including steering the ship, adjusting sails according to wind conditions, maintaining lookouts for other vessels or hazards, and conducting routine maintenance tasks such as splicing rope, mending canvas, and cleaning the deck and rigging. Food and water storage presented constant challenges for long voyages, as fresh provisions would spoil within days of departure from port. Ship's provisions typically consisted of preserved foods, including salt pork, salt beef, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and occasional luxuries such as cheese or butter that would keep for extended periods. Water was stored in large wooden casks, though it often became stagnant and unpalatable during long voyages, leading to the practice of adding rum or other spirits to improve its taste and prevent bacterial growth. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, remained a serious health concern despite growing awareness of its connection to diet, and ship surgeons gradually began recommending the consumption of citrus fruits and pickled vegetables as preventive measures. The physical demands of sailing ship operations required considerable strength, agility, and courage from crew members who regularly climbed into the rigging to adjust sails in all weather conditions. Working aloft, sometimes at heights exceeding 100 feet above the deck, sailors had to maintain their footing on narrow rope lines while handling heavy canvas sails and thick rope rigging, often in darkness or during storms when the ship was rolling and pitching unpredictably. Falls from the rigging were among the most common causes of serious injury or death aboard sailing ships, and experienced sailors developed specialized techniques for moving safely through the complex web of ropes, spars, and canvas that comprised a ship's sail system. Weather conditions played a determining role in every aspect of maritime life, from the speed and direction of travel to the safety and comfort of everyone aboard. Sailors learned to interpret subtle changes in wind patterns, cloud formations, and atmospheric pressure that could indicate approaching storms or favorable sailing conditions. The period between 1800 and 1850 saw numerous devastating hurricanes and typhoons that claimed entire fleets, including the Great Hurricane of 1804 that destroyed over 30 vessels in the Caribbean, and the typhoon of 1828 that sank more than 20 ships near the Philippines. These natural disasters reinforced the precarious nature of maritime life and the importance of seamanship skills in ensuring survival. Trade routes established during this period connected major commercial centers across the globe, with sailing ships following established patterns that took advantage of prevailing winds and ocean currents. The triangular trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the Americas continued into the early decades of the century. Though the abolition of the slave trade by Britain in 1807 and by the United States in 1808 gradually eliminated this particular form of commerce, the China trade routes connecting European and American ports with Canton and other Chinese cities became increasingly important as demand for tea, silk, and porcelain grew in Western markets. Maritime law during the 19th century was based on centuries of precedent and tradition, codified in various national legal systems and international agreements that governed behavior at sea. The Articles of War, which regulated naval service, prescribed specific punishments for offenses ranging from desertion and insubordination to theft and violence. Flogging remained a common disciplinary measure throughout much of the period, though reformers gradually advocated for more humane treatment of sailors. Captain's authority was nearly absolute during voyages, as communication with shore-based authorities was impossible once a ship left port, making the captain responsible for maintaining order, dispensing justice, and ensuring the safety of vessel and crew. The emergence of steam power in maritime transportation began to transform sailing ship operations by the 1840s and 1850s, though the transition was gradual and uneven across different types of vessels and trade routes. Early steamships burned enormous quantities of coal, limiting their range and cargo capacity, while sailing ships continued to offer advantages for long-distance voyages where fuel costs and storage space were significant concerns. Hybrid vessels combining both sail and steam power became common during the middle decades of the century, allowing captains to use wind power when conditions were favorable and switch to steam propulsion during calms or when maneuvering in harbors and rivers. The California Gold Rush of 1849 created unprecedented demand for rapid transportation to the American West Coast, leading to the development of the famous clipper ships that represented the pinnacle of sailing ship design and performance. These sleek vessels, built for speed rather than cargo capacity, could complete the voyage from New York to San Francisco in as little as 89 days under favorable conditions, compared to the 4 to 6 months required for the overland journey across the continent. The clipper ship era, lasting approximately from 1845 to 1860, produced some of the most celebrated vessels in maritime history, including the Flying Cloud, the Sovereign of the Seas, and the Lightning, each of which set speed records that demonstrated the ultimate potential of wind-powered transportation. Throughout the 19th century, technological innovations gradually improved the safety, efficiency, and comfort of maritime travel. Though life aboard sailing ships remained fundamentally challenging and dangerous, the introduction of iron hull construction in the 1830s and 1840s created stronger, more durable vessels that could withstand the stresses of ocean voyages better than traditional wooden ships. Improvements in sail design, rigging systems, and deck equipment reduced the physical demands on sailors while increasing the speed and maneuverability of sailing vessels. Better charts, more accurate navigational instruments, and improved understanding of global weather patterns helped reduce the risks associated with ocean travel, though maritime disasters continued to claim hundreds of lives annually throughout the period. The social and economic conditions that drove men to seek employment at sea remained relatively constant throughout the 19th century, with limited opportunities for advancement in land-based occupations, making maritime service an attractive option for young men from working-class families. Wages for ordinary seamen varied considerably depending on the type of voyage, destination, and availability of crew members, but typically ranged from $10 to $20 per month, plus room and board aboard ship. Officers and specialists commanded higher wages, with experienced captains earning substantial salaries that could support comfortable lifestyles ashore between voyages. The practice of paying wages only upon completion of voyages, combined with advance payments to families or creditors, often left sailors with limited financial resources and created a cycle of dependence on continued maritime employment. This financial arrangement reinforced the rigid hierarchical structure that governed every aspect of life aboard naval and merchant vessels of the era. The ship's organizational system represented a carefully constructed pyramid of authority that had evolved over centuries of maritime tradition, with each rank carrying specific responsibilities, privileges, and limitations that determined not only a sailor's duties, but his entire social standing within the floating community. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the captain, whose authority aboard ship was considered absolute and legally binding under maritime law. Naval regulations of the period, particularly those codified in the British Royal Navy's Articles of War of 1749, and their American counterparts established in 1800, granted captains sweeping powers that extended to matters of life and death. Captain James Cook, during his Pacific voyages between 1768 and 1779, exemplified the exercise of such authority, maintaining strict discipline through a combination of formal punishment and personal charisma that kept crews functional during voyages lasting several years. The captain's quarters, typically located in the stern of the vessel, reflected his status with private accommodations that might include a day cabin, sleeping quarters, and even a private galley, luxuries unimaginable to the common sailors housed in the cramped forecastle. Immediately below the captain in the chain of command were the ship's officers, a group that included the first mate, second mate, and various specialized positions depending on the vessel's size and purpose. The first mate, also known as the chief officer, served as the captain's primary deputy and was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the ship, including the supervision of watch schedules, maintenance of ship's equipment, and enforcement of discipline among the crew. Records from the Merchant Marine indicate that experienced first mates could earn between $30 and $50 per month during the 1840s and 1850s, a substantial increase over ordinary seamen's wages. The position required not only seamanship skills, but also literacy and mathematical competence for navigation calculations, cargo manifests, and maintaining the ship's log. The second mate occupied a somewhat precarious position within the hierarchy, ranking above the crew, but often treated with suspicion by both officers and sailors. Historical accounts from the whaling industry, particularly those documented in New Bedford shipping records from the 1820s through 1860s, reveal that second mates frequently found themselves caught between competing loyalties and expectations. They were expected to maintain officer dignity while performing many of the same physical tasks as ordinary seamen, creating tensions that sometimes erupted into conflicts requiring the captain's intervention. The second mate typically supervised specific aspects of ship operations, such as maintenance of rigging, oversight of cargo handling, or responsibility for particular watches during the sailing day. Below the commissioned officers was a class of petty officers and specialists whose skills were essential to ship operations but whose social status remained ambiguous within the maritime hierarchy. The boatswain, often shortened to bosun, held responsibility for the ship's rigging, anchors, cables, and deck equipment, making him one of the most technically important crew members. Maritime employment records from the port of Boston during the 1830s show that experienced boatswains could command wages of $25 to $30 per month, reflecting their specialized knowledge and supervisory responsibilities. The boatswain's mate assisted in these duties, while also serving as an intermediary between the boatswain and ordinary seamen, a position that required diplomatic skills as well as technical competence. The ship's carpenter represented another crucial specialist position, responsible for maintaining the vessel's structural integrity, repairing damage from storms or normal wear, and crafting replacement parts for broken equipment. Ship's carpenters of the period were typically experienced craftsmen who had completed formal apprenticeships ashore before taking to sea, and their skills were so valued that they enjoyed considerable job security and respect from both officers and crew. Documentation from the clipper ship era of the 1850s indicates that master carpenters aboard the fastest Pacific trade vessels could earn wages comparable to second mates while enjoying greater autonomy in their daily work. The cook occupied a unique position within the ship's social structure, wielding influence that often exceeded his formal rank due to his control over the crew's food supply and meal preparation. Naval historians have noted that skilled cooks could significantly impact crew morale and even influence minor disciplinary matters through their relationships with both officers and sailors. The galley served as an informal communication center where news, complaints, and rumors circulated freely, making the cook privy to information that might not reach other crew members. Ship's cooks were typically appointed by the captain and could be dismissed at his pleasure, creating a dynamic where culinary skills had to be balanced with political awareness and loyalty to ship's leadership. Ordinary seamen formed the backbone of the ship's crew, performing the essential tasks of sailing, maintenance, and cargo handling that kept vessels operational throughout their voyages. These men were divided into two primary categories: able seamen and ordinary seamen, distinctions that reflected experience levels, skill competencies, and earning potential. Able seamen were expected to demonstrate proficiency in all aspects of seamanship, including the ability to hand, reef, and steer, work aloft in all weather conditions, and perform emergency repairs to rigging and sails. Maritime employment records from New York shipping companies during the 1840s show that able seamen typically earned between $12 and $18 per month, depending on the vessel type, voyage duration, and prevailing labor market conditions. Ordinary seamen, often young men learning the maritime trades or experienced landlubbers seeking their first sea employment, performed more basic tasks under supervision while gradually acquiring the skills necessary for advancement. These crew members handled routine maintenance, assisted with cargo operations, stood watches under supervision, and performed the endless tasks of cleaning, painting, and repair that kept ships seaworthy. The apprenticeship system that governed advancement from ordinary to able seamen was largely informal, based on demonstrated competence and acceptance by existing crew members rather than formal examinations or certifications. The watch system that organized daily ship operations represented one of the most important aspects of maritime hierarchy, dividing the crew into rotating groups responsible for sailing the vessel during specific periods. The traditional 4-hour watch system, modified by the distinctive dog watches of 2 hours each during the evening, ensured that no crew member consistently worked the same hours day after day while maintaining continuous supervision of ship operations. Watch officers, typically the first and second mates, bore responsibility for navigation, sail handling decisions, and crew supervision during their assigned periods, creating a system of distributed authority that functioned even when the captain was unavailable. Within each watch, crew members were assigned specific stations and responsibilities that reflected both the ship's organizational needs and individual competencies. The helmsman, responsible for steering the vessel according to compass bearings and officer instructions, held a position of particular trust and responsibility. Lookouts posted in the bow and sometimes aloft maintained constant surveillance for other vessels, hazards to navigation, and changes in weather conditions. The complexity of sail handling on square-rigged vessels required coordinated teams of sailors working in dangerous conditions high above the deck, activities that demanded not only physical courage, but also precise timing and communication. disciplinary systems aboard 19th century vessels reflected the absolute nature of maritime authority, while incorporating both formal punishments prescribed by naval regulations and informal sanctions imposed by crew social structures. The ship's articles, signed by crew members at the beginning of voyages, specified wages, duties, and punishments for various offences, creating a contractual framework for shipboard behaviour. Common punishments included reduction in wages, extra duty assignments, confinement to quarters, and in severe cases, flogging or being put ashore at the next port. The cat o' nine tails, a multi-stranded whip used for formal punishment, remained a standard disciplinary tool aboard many vessels well into the 1850s, despite growing criticism of corporal punishment from maritime reform movements. The reading of ships' articles at the beginning of voyages represented a formal ceremony that established the legal and social framework governing crew behavior throughout the upcoming journey. These documents, required by maritime law in most seafaring nations, specified not only wages and disciplinary procedures, but also detailed expectations for crew conduct, work performance, and obedience to officers. Violations of ships' articles could result in forfeiture of wages, discharge from service, or even criminal prosecution in extreme cases, making the initial signing ceremony a significant legal commitment for all participants. Social interactions within the ship's hierarchy were governed by complex traditions and customs that reinforced rank distinctions while maintaining the cooperation necessary for vessel operations. Officers typically messed separately from crew members, maintained distinct sleeping quarters, and observed formal protocols in their interactions with subordinates. The quarterdeck, traditionally reserved for officers and their authorized guests, represented a physical manifestation of social boundaries that ordinary sailors crossed only when specifically summoned or assigned duties requiring their presence in that area of the vessel. Despite these formal hierarchies, successful ship operations required a degree of mutual dependence that could temporarily suspend normal social distinctions during emergencies or particularly demanding sailing conditions. Storms, equipment failures, or encounters with hostile forces created situations where survival depended on coordinated effort from all crew members, regardless of rank, leading to temporary suspensions of normal protocol in favor of practical necessity. These experiences often created bonds between officers and crew that persisted beyond individual voyages, contributing to the tight-knit nature of maritime communities in major ports. The promotion system within maritime hierarchies combined formal advancement based on demonstrated competence with informal recognition from peers and superiors, creating pathways for advancement that rewarded both technical skills and leadership abilities. Ambitious sailors could advance through the ranks over the course of several voyages, moving from ordinary seaman to able seaman, then potentially to petty officer positions, and eventually to officer rank through a combination of experience, education, and opportunity. This mobility, while limited by social and economic factors, provided one of the few avenues for working-class advancement available in 19th century society, making maritime careers attractive to men seeking to improve their social and economic circumstances. However, before examining the specific advancement opportunities available to 19th century sailors, it is essential to understand the rigid daily structure within which these men lived and worked during their months at sea. The daily routines aboard both merchant and naval vessels of this period were governed by centuries-old maritime traditions, practical necessities, and the absolute requirement for maintaining order among dozens or sometimes hundreds of men confined in the wooden world of a ship. These routines varied significantly between merchant vessels and naval ships, though both shared certain fundamental characteristics rooted in the demands of ocean navigation and the maintenance of sailing vessels. The day aboard a typical merchant vessel of the 1840s began at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, when the ship's bell would sound 8 bells, marking the end of the middle watch and the beginning of the morning watch. This system of timekeeping, known as ship's time, divided each 24-hour period into 6 watches of 4 hours each, with the exception of the 2 dog watches in the evening, which lasted only 2 hours each. The morning watch, running from 4 in the morning until 8, was considered one of the most demanding periods of the day, as it required sailors to emerge from their cramped sleeping quarters below deck into the often cold and damp conditions of the early morning sea air. The first task of the morning watch involved what sailors called turning to, a process that began with the boatswain or his mate moving through the crew quarters, rousing the men assigned to the morning watch with calls of all hands, up anchor, or similar traditional phrases. The sailors would then stumble from their hammocks, which regulations typically required to be stowed away within 14 minutes of the watch change. Records from the British Merchant Marine indicate that failure to properly stow hammocks within the allotted time could result in the loss of a day's pay or other punishments, depending on the captain's disposition and the vessel's articles of agreement. Once on deck, the morning watch crew would begin the process of washing down the decks, a ritual that maritime historians believe served both practical and psychological purposes. The practical benefits included removing the salt spray and general debris that accumulated during the night hours, while the psychological aspect helped establish the day's routine and reinforce the hierarchical structure of shipboard life. This deck washing process, known as holystoning, involved the use of sandstone blocks called holystones, which sailors would drag across the wooden deck planking while on their hands and knees. The larger holystones were nicknamed Bibles, while smaller ones were called prayer books, terminology that reflected both their size and the prayer-like posture required to use them effectively. The holystoning process typically consumed the first hour of the morning watch, after which the crew would begin the daily inspection and maintenance of the ship's rigging. This examination of ropes, sails, and hardware was absolutely critical to the vessel's safety, as the constant motion of the ship, combined with the corrosive effects of salt air and water, created ongoing wear that could prove catastrophic if left unaddressed. Experienced able seamen would climb into the rigging to examine the condition of the standing rigging that supported the masts, while ordinary seamen remained on deck to inspect the running rigging used to control the sails. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, the ship's cook would begin preparing the day's first meal, though the term cook often overstated the culinary skills of the individual assigned to this duty. On many merchant vessels of the period, the cook was frequently a sailor who had been injured and could no longer perform the more physically demanding aspects of seamanship, or an older crew member whose advancing years made climbing rigging inadvisable. The cooking facilities aboard most merchant ships consisted of a brick or iron galley located amidships, equipped with a wood-burning stove that was carefully designed to minimize fire risk through the use of sand-filled fireboxes and metal heat shields. The morning meal, served at 8 o'clock with the change of watch, typically consisted of what sailors called burgoo, a porridge-like mixture of oatmeal, ship's biscuit, and whatever preserved meat might be available. Ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, formed the foundation of maritime nutrition throughout the 19th century, consisting of flour, water, and salt, baked into hard, long-lasting wafers that could survive months at sea without spoiling. However, these biscuits frequently became infested with weevils and other insects, leading to the common sailor practice of tapping biscuits against the table before eating to dislodge any unwanted inhabitants. Following the morning meal, the day watch would assume responsibility for the vessel's operation, allowing the morning watch crew to rest until their next assigned duty period. The day watch, running from 8 in the morning until noon, represented the period of peak activity aboard most merchant vessels. During these 4 hours, the crew would engage in the countless maintenance tasks required to keep a sailing ship operational, including splicing rope, patching sails, scraping and painting ironwork, and overhauling the complex system of blocks and tackle that controlled the vessel's sail plan. The noon hour held special significance aboard ships of this period, as it marked the time for taking the sun's meridian altitude to determine the vessel's latitude. This navigational observation, performed by the ship's master or chief mate using a sextant, represented one of the most critical daily routines aboard any ocean-going vessel. The mathematical calculations required to convert sextant readings into usable position information demanded considerable skill and education, highlighting the distinction between the ship's officers and the common sailors who performed the physical labor of sailing the vessel. Records from the American Merchant Marine of the 1850s indicate that the noon meal served immediately after the navigational observations were completed, typically provided the most substantial food of the day. This meal often included salt pork or salt beef, beans, and occasionally vegetables if a ship had departed port recently enough for fresh provisions to remain edible. The quality and quantity of food varied dramatically between different vessels and shipping companies, with some owners providing barely adequate nutrition, while others recognized that well-fed crews performed more effectively and experienced fewer incidents of disease and desertion. The afternoon watch, extending from noon until 4 o'clock, frequently involved the most demanding physical labor of the day, particularly if weather conditions required adjustments to the vessel's sail configuration. The process of shortening sail in anticipation of deteriorating weather, known as taking in sail, required the coordinated efforts of the entire crew and demonstrated the importance of the rigid hierarchy that governed shipboard operations. The master or chief mate would determine which sails needed to be reduced or furled entirely, while the second mate and boatswain would organize the crew into working parties assigned to specific tasks. The actual process of taking in sail began with the command to lay aloft, sending sailors climbing up the ratlines to reach the yards from which the sails were suspended. Once positioned along the yards, these men would wait for the command to furl sail, at which point they would gather in the canvas and secure it with gaskets, short ropes designed specifically for this purpose. The coordination required for this operation was remarkable, as a mistake by any individual sailor could result in injury to his shipmates or damage to the vessel's equipment. During periods of favorable weather, the afternoon watch might instead focus on more routine maintenance activities, such as overhauling the ship's boats, inspecting and repairing sail inventory, or performing carpentry work to address the constant problem of wood rot in the vessel's structure. Many merchant ships of this period carried a crew member designated as the ship's carpenter, though on smaller vessels this role might be filled by any sailor with relevant experience. The carpenter's responsibilities included maintaining the vessel's watertight integrity, repairing damage to masts and yards, and constructing or modifying equipment as needed during the voyage. The evening routine aboard merchant vessels began at 4 o'clock with the commencement of the first dog watch, a 2-hour period that extended until 6 in the evening. This abbreviated watch served the important function of ensuring that crew members did not work the same time periods day after day, as the odd number of total watch periods caused the schedule to rotate continuously. The first dog watch typically involved preparing the evening meal and completing any urgent maintenance tasks that had been identified during the day's operations. At 6 o'clock, the second dog watch began, lasting until 8 in the evening and generally representing the most relaxed period of the shipboard day. During these 2 hours, off-duty sailors might engage in personal activities such as mending clothing, writing letters to be posted at the next port of call, or participating in informal entertainment. The nature of this entertainment varied considerably, depending on the composition of the crew and the attitude of the ship's officers, but commonly included storytelling, singing traditional sea chanties, or playing simple games using dice or cards if the captain permitted gambling aboard his vessel. The evening meal, served during the second dog watch, typically consisted of the same basic components as the noon meal, though often in smaller quantities. Water remained a constant concern aboard merchant vessels of this period, as the wooden casks used for storage frequently developed leaks or became contaminated during long voyages. The daily water ration for each crew member was carefully measured and distributed, usually amounting to approximately 1 gallon per man per day for all purposes, including drinking, cooking, and personal hygiene. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the first watch commenced, lasting until midnight and marking the beginning of the night routine that would continue until the following morning. The first watch crew assumed responsibility for navigating the vessel through the hours of darkness, a task that required constant vigilance and considerable skill, particularly during the periods of reduced visibility or challenging weather conditions. The officer of the watch, typically the second mate on merchant vessels, maintained continuous oversight of the ship's course and speed, while monitoring weather conditions and watching for other vessels or navigational hazards. The crew members assigned to the first watch spent their 4 hours alternating between active duties and periods of relative inactivity, depending on the vessel's requirements and prevailing conditions. Active duties included steering the ship, adjusting sails as wind conditions changed, and maintaining lookout positions to watch for potential dangers. During calmer periods, watchstanders might engage in quiet conversation or individual activities, though maritime regulations typically prohibited sleeping while on duty, with violations subject to severe punishment, including loss of pay or additional duty assignments. At midnight, the middle watch began, extending until 4 in the morning, and representing what many sailors considered the most challenging period of the 24-hour cycle. The middle watch required crew members to remain alert and functional during the hours when human physiology naturally tends toward sleep, often while dealing with cold temperatures and the disorienting effects of darkness on the open ocean. The crew assigned to this watch faced the same basic responsibilities as their counterparts during other periods, but with the added difficulties imposed by fatigue and reduced visibility. The daily routines aboard naval vessels of the 19th century followed many of the same basic patterns as those observed on merchant ships, but with significant differences reflecting the military nature and larger crew sizes typical of warships. These larger crews necessitated more complex systems for the distribution and management of food supplies, which brings us to examine the fundamental challenge that consumed much of the attention of ships' officers and administrators throughout the 19th century: the provisioning and rationing of food and water for extended voyages at sea. The provisioning of a sailing vessel represented one of the most critical aspects of voyage preparation, requiring calculations that could mean the difference between successful completion of a journey and catastrophic failure, resulting in starvation or scurvy among the crew. Ship's pursers and supply officers worked with mathematical precision to determine the quantities of various foodstuffs required based on established daily rations multiplied by the number of crew members and the estimated duration of the voyage, plus additional reserves to account for delays caused by adverse weather conditions or other unforeseen circumstances. The British Royal Navy, which maintained the most extensive and well-documented provisioning system of the era, established standardized daily rations through a series of Admiralty regulations that were refined and updated throughout the 19th century. According to records maintained by the Naval Victualling Board, the standard daily ration for a British sailor in the year 1815 consisted of 1 pound of hardtack biscuit, 1 pound of salt beef or pork, depending on the day of the week, 1 pint of dried peas, 4 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of cheese, and 1 gallon of beer when available, or alternatively a half pint of rum diluted with water to create the mixture known as grog. The hardtack biscuit, also referred to as ship's bread or pilot bread, formed the cornerstone of maritime nutrition throughout this period and deserves particular attention due to its universal presence aboard vessels of all nations. These rectangular biscuits, typically measuring approximately 4 inches by 4 inches and half an inch in thickness, were baked using only flour and water, with salt occasionally added as a preservative. The baking process involved multiple stages, with the dough first being rolled to uniform thickness, then cut into precise shapes and baked in large ovens for extended periods to remove virtually all moisture content. The manufacture of hardtack represented a significant industry in major port cities throughout Europe and North America, with establishments such as the Crown Pilot Cracker Company in Boston, founded in 1846, and similar enterprises in Portsmouth, Plymouth, and other British naval centres, producing millions of these biscuits annually for maritime consumption. Records from the Deptford Royal Naval Victualling Yard indicate that during peak periods of the Napoleonic Wars, this single facility produced more than 16 million pounds of ship's biscuit each year, requiring the labour of hundreds of bakers working in continuous shifts. The preservation and storage of meat supplies presented equally complex challenges, with salt pork and salt beef packed in wooden barrels forming the primary sources of protein for most vessels. The salting process, which had remained essentially unchanged since medieval times, involved layering fresh cuts of meat with coarse salt in carefully constructed wooden casks, then adding brine solutions to fill any remaining spaces and exclude air that might promote spoilage. The quality of these preserved meats varied considerably, depending on the skill of the packers, the freshness of the original meat, and the conditions under which the barrels were stored aboard ship. Naval regulations specified precise procedures for the inspection and testing of salt meat before acceptance for shipboard use, with supply officers required to examine random samples from each barrel delivery and reject any lots showing signs of spoilage or inadequate preservation. Despite these precautions, contemporary accounts from sailors' journals frequently describe meat that had become so thoroughly saturated with salt and deteriorated during extended storage that it required prolonged soaking in seawater before becoming even marginally edible, and even then often retained an unappetizing grey colour and tough, fibrous texture. The distribution of daily rations followed strict procedures designed to ensure fairness and prevent disputes among crew members, with the ship's cook and his assistants responsible for measuring out precise quantities according to established regulations. The process typically began before dawn, with the cook's crew preparing the day's meals in the galley, a confined space usually located near the center of the ship, where a brick or iron firebox provided the only source of heat for food preparation. Records from the merchant vessel Manchester, sailing between Liverpool and Charleston in 1837, describe the cook beginning his duties at 4 o'clock each morning, first lighting the galley fire and then beginning the lengthy process of soaking salt meat and preparing the communal pot of burgoo or other grain-based porridge that would constitute the morning meal. Water rationing represented an even more critical concern than food distribution, as the limited storage capacity for fresh water aboard sailing vessels meant that careful conservation became essential for crew survival during extended passages. Standard water allowances varied depending on the nature of the voyage and the availability of opportunities for resupply, but typically ranged from 1 gallon per person per day for short coastal voyages to as little as 1 quart per person per day during extended ocean crossings where water conservation became paramount. The storage of fresh water presented numerous technical challenges, with wooden casks representing the primary storage method throughout most of the 19th century, despite their tendency to develop leaks and their susceptibility to contamination by various microorganisms that could render the water unpalatable or dangerous to consume. Ship's carpenters devoted considerable attention to the maintenance and repair of water casks, as even small leaks could result in the loss of precious supplies that could not be replaced until the vessel reached its next port of call. The quality of stored water deteriorated predictably during extended voyages, developing what sailors commonly described as a stagnant, musty taste, often accompanied by a greenish discoloration caused by algae growth and the presence of small insects or worms that managed to establish themselves in the storage containers, despite efforts at prevention. Contemporary accounts describe various methods employed by crews to improve the palatability of deteriorated water, including straining it through cloth filters, adding small quantities of vinegar or wine when available, or boiling it to eliminate some of the offensive odors and flavors that developed over time. The procurement of provisions required extensive planning and coordination between ship owners, supply merchants, and port authorities, with the process often beginning weeks or months before a vessel's scheduled departure. Large merchant houses specializing in ship chandlery operated in every major port, maintaining extensive inventories of preserved foods, cooperage supplies, and other necessities required for extended voyages. The firm of Cross and Blackwell, established in London in 1706, became particularly renowned for its high-quality preserved foods and maintained contracts with numerous shipping lines throughout the 19th century. The cost of provisioning represented a significant expense for ship owners and naval administrators, with detailed records maintained by the British Admiralty, indicating that food and water supplies typically accounted for approximately 15 to 20% of total voyage costs for naval vessels, and often an even higher percentage for merchant ships operating with smaller crews and tighter profit margins. These expenses varied considerably depending on the prevailing prices of agricultural commodities, the availability of supplies in different ports, and seasonal fluctuations that could dramatically affect the cost of basic foodstuffs. Supplementary provisioning during voyages provided opportunities to improve diet quality when circumstances permitted, with ships' officers consistently seeking opportunities to acquire fresh foods, vegetables, and water whenever possible during port calls or encounters with other vessels. The practice of trading with local populations in remote locations became common among merchant vessels, with ship stores of manufactured goods, tools, or other European products exchanged for fresh fruits, vegetables, livestock, or other perishable foods that could provide temporary relief from the monotony and nutritional deficiencies of standard shipboard rations. The role of the ship's purser or supply officer evolved considerably during the 19th century as the complexity and scale of maritime operations increased, requiring individuals with mathematical skills, accounting knowledge, and practical experience in food preservation and storage techniques. These officers maintained detailed records of consumption rates, monitored the condition of stored supplies, and made critical decisions about rationing adjustments when voyages extended beyond their originally planned duration due to weather delays, navigational errors, or other unforeseen circumstances. Special dietary considerations occasionally arose during voyages, particularly regarding the treatment of sick or injured crew members whose medical conditions might require modifications to standard rations. Ship's medical officers, when present, sometimes prescribed alternative foods or preparation methods for crew members suffering from scurvy, dysentery, or other ailments common aboard sailing vessels, though the limited variety of available foods severely constrained the options for dietary therapy. Records from the whaling vessel Essex prior to its famous encounter with a sperm whale in 1820 describe the captain authorizing additional rations of preserved fruits and rum for crew members showing early symptoms of scurvy during an extended cruise in the Pacific Ocean. The psychological aspects of food distribution and consumption aboard ship deserve recognition as significant factors in maintaining crew morale and discipline during extended voyages, with the communal preparation and sharing of meals representing important social rituals that helped maintain group cohesion under the stressful conditions of maritime life. The tradition of celebrating special occasions with enhanced rations or special foods when supplies permitted provided welcome breaks from routine that crew members anticipated and remembered long after their voyages concluded. These shared experiences of sustenance and survival naturally prepared sailors for the equally communal responsibility of navigation, where knowledge was passed from experienced hands to novices through careful observation and methodical instruction. The art of finding one's position at sea required a combination of mathematical precision, astronomical knowledge, and practical experience that distinguished the professional mariner from the casual seafarer. Records from the British Admiralty indicate that by the early 1800s, the complexity of navigational calculations had reached such sophistication that dedicated navigation officers were becoming standard aboard vessels of significant tonnage, typically those exceeding 300 tons burden. The fundamental challenge facing 19th century navigators was determining their exact position on a seemingly featureless ocean, using only the celestial bodies visible above and the mathematical principles developed over centuries of maritime exploration. Dead reckoning, the most basic form of navigation, involved maintaining a continuous record of the ship's direction and estimated speed to calculate position relative to the last known point. Ship's logs from the period demonstrate the meticulous attention paid to these calculations, with entries recorded every 4 hours during watch changes, noting wind direction, sail configuration, estimated speed through water, and any corrections made for current or leeway. The traverse board, a wooden device marked with compass points and fitted with pegs, served as the primary tool for tracking the ship's course during each watch. Historians believe this instrument evolved from earlier Mediterranean navigational practices, reaching its standardized form by approximately 1650. though variations continue to appear in different maritime traditions throughout the 19th century. The quartermaster would move pegs to indicate the ship's heading and estimated speed, creating a visual record that the navigator would later translate into mathematical calculations for the ship's position. Celestial navigation represented the pinnacle of maritime mathematical skill, requiring navigators to master complex trigonometric calculations while working in the confined and often unstable environment of a ship's cabin. The sextant, perfected in the 1750s by John Campbell and refined throughout the subsequent decades, enabled navigators to measure the angle between celestial bodies and the horizon with unprecedented accuracy. By the 1820s, quality sextants manufactured by firms such as Troughton and Sims in London could achieve measurements accurate to within 10 seconds of arc, though such precision instruments remained expensive and were typically found only aboard naval vessels or the finest merchant ships. The process of taking a celestial sight required careful timing and mathematical computation that could occupy a navigator for several hours following the brief moments of actual observation. At local apparent noon, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the navigator would measure the sun's altitude using the sextant, then consult detailed mathematical tables to determine the ship's latitude. The Nautical Almanac, first published by the British Admiralty in 1767 under the direction of Neville Maskelyne, provided the essential astronomical data required for these calculations, including the sun's declination for each day of the year and the positions of navigational stars. Longitude determination proved far more challenging than latitude calculation, requiring either accurate timekeeping or complex lunar observations that tested even experienced navigators' mathematical abilities. The marine chronometer, developed by John Harrison in the 18th century and refined by subsequent craftsmen such as Thomas Earnshaw and John Arnold, provided the most reliable method for determining longitude at sea. By comparing local apparent time, determined through solar observation, with the time maintained by the chronometer set to Greenwich Mean Time, navigators could calculate their east-west position with reasonable accuracy. However, chronometers remained expensive instruments throughout much of the 19th century, with quality timepieces costing between £50 and £100, representing several years' wages for ordinary seamen. Consequently, many merchant vessels continued to rely on lunar distance observations, a technique that required measuring the angular distance between the moon and selected stars or the sun, then performing elaborate calculations using specialized tables. The lunar distance method, while theoretically capable of great accuracy, demanded considerable mathematical skill and could require up to 4 hours of computation to produce a reliable longitude fix. The mathematical tables essential for celestial navigation represented centuries of astronomical observation and calculation, compiled by institutions such as the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and distributed through official publications updated annually. The requisite tables included logarithmic functions for trigonometric calculations, star catalogues providing celestial coordinates, solar declination tables showing the sun's position throughout the year, and correction factors accounting for atmospheric refraction, instrument error, and the observer's height above sea level. Navigators typically carried multiple sets of these publications, as damage to navigational references could render celestial observations impossible to interpret correctly. Training in celestial navigation traditionally occurred through apprenticeship systems, where experienced navigators instructed younger officers in the theoretical principles and practical techniques required for accurate position finding. The mathematical education necessary for competent navigation exceeded the formal schooling available to most 19th century individuals, requiring familiarity with logarithms, trigonometry, and spherical geometry concepts typically encountered only in advanced mathematical studies. Navigation schools established in major ports such as London, Liverpool, and Boston provided formal instruction for aspiring officers, though the majority of navigational knowledge continued to be transmitted through direct mentorship aboard working vessels. Weather conditions significantly affected the accuracy and frequency of celestial observations, with overcast skies preventing sight-taking for days or weeks during certain seasons, and in particular geographic regions. The North Atlantic, notorious for its frequent fog and storm systems, could leave navigators dependent on dead reckoning for extended periods, gradually reducing confidence in their calculated position as time passed without celestial confirmation. Ships' logs from transatlantic crossings frequently record periods of 5 to 10 days without successful sun sights, forcing navigators to rely entirely on compass bearings, estimated speeds, and calculations of wind drift and current set. The magnetic compass, while essential for maintaining course between celestial observations, introduced its own complexities, requiring careful attention and regular correction. Magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, changed gradually with geographic location and required navigators to maintain detailed records of local magnetic properties based on previous voyages and published charts. Iron components within the ship's structure created additional magnetic deviation that varied with the vessel's heading, necessitating the creation of deviation tables specific to each ship through careful compass observations in different ports. Chart work represented another fundamental aspect of 19th century navigation, requiring navigators to maintain accurate plots of their vessel's position and intended course using the best available geographic information. The quality and accuracy of nautical charts improved dramatically during this period, with systematic surveys conducted by national hydrographic offices producing increasingly detailed representations of coastal waters and known hazards. The British Admiralty charts, begun under the direction of Captain Thomas Hurd in 1795, established standards for accuracy and presentation that influenced maritime cartography worldwide. However, many remote regions remained imperfectly surveyed throughout the 19th century, with charts based on incomplete or outdated observations that could place dangerous reefs or rocks several miles from their actual positions. Prudent navigators maintained detailed records of their own observations, noting discrepancies between charted positions and actual geographic features, contributing to the gradual improvement of nautical charts through accumulated experience from multiple voyages. The practice of sharing navigational intelligence between vessels and with chart publishers represented an informal but vital system for improving maritime safety. Time management in celestial navigation required careful coordination with the ship's daily routine, as the most important observations needed to be taken at specific moments determined by astronomical conditions rather than human convenience. The morning star sight, typically taken during nautical twilight when both horizon and stars remained visible, required the navigator to be prepared with sextant and chronometer at the precise moment when observing conditions reached their optimum. Similarly, the noon sight for latitude determination demanded readiness during the brief period when the sun reached its maximum altitude, often requiring interruption of other shipboard duties. The physical challenges of taking accurate sextant sights from a moving vessel in potentially rough seas tested both the navigator's skill and physical endurance, maintaining stable footing while manipulating the delicate adjustments of the sextant, simultaneously observing the horizon and celestial body, required considerable practice and steady nerves. Experienced navigators developed techniques for bracing themselves against the ship's motion while keeping the sextant level and the observed body properly aligned with the horizon, skills that could only be developed through extensive practical experience in varying sea conditions. Record keeping formed an essential component of competent navigation, with detailed logs maintained not only for immediate navigation purposes, but also as references for future voyages over similar routes. The navigator's workbook contained courses steered, distances run, celestial observations, calculated positions, and corrections applied for various factors affecting the ship's movement through the water. These records served multiple purposes, providing legal documentation of the vessel's movements, evidence of the navigator's competence and diligence, and valuable reference material for subsequent voyages when similar conditions might be encountered in familiar waters. These detailed navigational records proved particularly valuable when correlating ship movements with the seasonal weather patterns that governed maritime commerce throughout the 19th century. The accumulated wisdom contained within these logbooks revealed consistent atmospheric behaviors that experienced mariners came to rely upon with considerable precision. Weather patterns in the age of sail followed predictable seasonal cycles, and understanding these meteorological rhythms meant the difference between profitable voyages and devastating losses at sea. The trade wind systems that dominated global sailing routes operated according to well-established seasonal variations that shipmasters documented with meticulous care. In the Atlantic Ocean, the northeast trade winds typically maintained their most reliable strength between November and April, blowing steadily from approximately 15 degrees north latitude down to the equatorial doldrums. During these months, vessels departing European ports could expect consistent winds of 12 to 18 knots, allowing merchant ships to maintain average speeds of 6 to 8 knots on southwesterly courses toward the Caribbean or South American destinations. Conversely, the summer months from May through October brought significant alterations to these wind patterns, with the trade wind belt shifting northward and becoming considerably less reliable. Ships' logs from the period consistently record increased instances of calms and variable winds during these months, forcing navigators to seek alternative routes or accept substantially longer passage times. The merchant vessel Britannia, operating between Liverpool and Barbados during the 1840s, recorded average passage times of 28 days during winter months compared to 37 days for identical routes attempted during summer seasons. The monsoon systems affecting Indian Ocean navigation presented even more dramatic seasonal considerations that required precise timing for commercial success. The southwest monsoon, locally known as the wet monsoon, typically established itself between late May and early October, bringing consistent winds from the southwest quarter, along with torrential rainfall across much of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. During this period, vessels sailing from European ports toward India could utilize these powerful winds to achieve remarkably fast passages, with some East Indiamen completing the journey from the English Channel to Bombay in as little as 90 days. However, the northeast monsoon, prevailing from November through March, completely reversed these wind patterns and created entirely different sailing conditions. Ships attempting to reach Indian ports during the northeast monsoon faced headwinds for much of their approach, often requiring complex routing strategies that took advantage of coastal wind variations and local weather phenomena. The records of the East India Company indicate that vessels departing London during inappropriate monsoon seasons might require up to 150 days to reach their destinations, representing a 60-day penalty for poor seasonal timing. Captain James Lancaster, commanding various East India Company vessels during the early decades of the 19th century, documented extensive observations regarding monsoon timing and its effects on commercial operations. His logs indicate that cargo vessels achieving optimal scheduling could complete 2 round-trip voyages between England and India within a single year, while ships departing at unfavorable times might manage only 1 complete voyage cycle. This seasonal timing directly affected the profitability of trading ventures, as merchants who understood monsoon patterns could achieve significant competitive advantages over rivals who ignored these meteorological realities. The hurricane seasons of the Atlantic presented perhaps the most dangerous seasonal weather considerations facing 19th century mariners. Caribbean and North American hurricane activity typically peaked between August and October, with September representing the month of greatest risk for vessels operating in tropical Atlantic waters. Ship's masters learned to avoid Caribbean routes during these months whenever possible, or to accept the substantial risks associated with hurricane encounters at sea. The devastating hurricane of September 1846 demonstrated the catastrophic potential of these seasonal storms when it struck a fleet of merchant vessels near the Bahama Islands. Contemporary accounts indicate that 17 ships were lost during this single storm event, with cargo valued at more than £200,000 sterling disappearing beneath the waves. Survivors' testimonies reveal wind velocities that exceeded anything previously recorded in their experience, with seas reaching heights that made normal sailing procedures completely ineffective. Insurance companies operating during this period adjusted their premium structures to reflect seasonal hurricane risks, typically charging rates that were 30 to 40% higher for voyages scheduled during peak hurricane months. The London maritime insurance market, centred around Lloyd's Coffee House and later the formal Lloyd's of London organisation, maintained detailed records of seasonal loss patterns that clearly demonstrated the correlation between hurricane seasons and maritime casualties. Maritime weather observation during the 19th century relied heavily on barometric pressure readings, wind direction measurements, and cloud formation analysis to predict approaching weather systems. The mercury barometer, perfected during the previous century, became an essential instrument aboard commercial vessels, with experienced masters learning to interpret pressure variations as indicators of approaching storms or favorable weather changes. A rapid barometric decline of more than 1 inch of mercury within 24 hours typically indicated severe weather approaching within the next day or two. The seasonal behavior of ocean currents presented additional considerations that influenced routing decisions and passage planning throughout the year. The Gulf Stream, flowing northeastward along the North American coast before turning toward Europe, exhibited seasonal variations in both strength and position that affected transatlantic navigation. During winter months, this current typically flowed at velocities approaching 3 knots near the Florida Straits, gradually diminishing to approximately 1 knot as it approached European waters. Summer modifications to Gulf Stream behavior included a northward shift in the current's path and some reduction in flow velocity, changes that experienced navigators incorporated into their passage planning calculations. Vessels sailing from American ports to Europe could gain substantial time advantages by utilizing Gulf Stream assistance, while ships traveling in the opposite direction needed to avoid this current to prevent significant delays. Navigation records from the period indicate that proper utilization of seasonal current patterns could reduce transatlantic passage times by up to 1 week. The Labrador Current, flowing southward along the North American coast, created particularly hazardous conditions during spring and early summer months when Arctic ice reached its southernmost extent. Icebergs originating from Greenland glaciers typically appeared off the Newfoundland banks between March and July, with peak iceberg density occurring during May and June. Ships operating in these waters during ice season faced constant danger from collision with these massive floating obstacles, which could appear suddenly in fog conditions that frequently accompanied the meeting of warm Gulf Stream water with cold Labrador current flows. The tragic loss of numerous vessels to iceberg encounters during this period led to the development of more conservative routing practices during ice season. The package ship Arctic, operating between New York and Liverpool, was lost with tremendous casualties in September 1854, following a collision that historians believe involved either an iceberg or another vessel in heavy fog conditions typical of the region during ice season. Seasonal considerations for Pacific Ocean navigation presented unique challenges related to the vast distances involved and the complex interaction of multiple weather systems across this enormous body of water. The California Current System, flowing southward along the western coast of North America, exhibited seasonal strength variations that significantly affected vessels engaged in trade between Pacific coast ports and Hawaii or Asia. During summer months, this current typically maintained velocities of 1 to 2 knots, while winter conditions often reduced current strength and occasionally produced temporary reversals in nearshore areas. Typhoon activity in the western Pacific followed seasonal patterns similar to Atlantic hurricanes, but with somewhat different timing and geographic distribution. The typhoon season typically extended from May through November, with peak activity occurring during August and September across the South China Sea and Philippine archipelago. Vessels engaged in the China trade learned to schedule their movements to avoid typhoon-prone areas during these high-risk months, often remaining in port for extended periods rather than risk encountering these devastating storms at sea. The northeast and southwest monsoons affecting Pacific navigation created seasonal windows of opportunity for various trading routes, particularly those connecting Asian ports with destinations in India, Australia, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Ships operating between Canton and Calcutta, for example, required careful coordination with monsoon timing to achieve acceptable passage times and avoid contrary winds that could extend voyages beyond commercially viable limits. Records maintained by the British East India Company's Pacific operations indicate that vessels achieving optimal monsoon timing could complete the Canton to Calcutta route in approximately 45 days, while ships encountering unfavorable seasonal conditions might require 75 days for identical voyages. This 30-day difference represented substantial additional costs for provisions, crew wages, and lost commercial opportunities that could determine the success or failure of trading ventures. These economic pressures, created by prolonged voyages, made the careful management of port operations absolutely essential for maintaining profitability. When merchant vessels finally reached their destinations, the procedures for entering port followed established protocols that had been refined over decades of international maritime commerce. British Admiralty records from 1847 indicate that major trading ports such as Portsmouth, Liverpool, and Bristol maintained harbour masters whose primary responsibility involved the systematic processing of incoming vessels according to their tonnage, cargo manifest, and crew complement. The initial approach to port required ships to display proper identification signals, typically consisting of flag combinations that corresponded to the vessel's registry and ownership. Maritime historians have documented that the Port of London Authority, established in its formal capacity in 1857, required incoming vessels to anchor in designated holding areas, while customs officials conducted preliminary inspections. These procedures, which could extend from 6 hours to 3 full days, depending on the complexity of the cargo and the thoroughness of documentation review, determined when crews might finally be granted shore leave privileges. Shore leave policies varied considerably between merchant vessels and naval ships, with merchant sailors generally enjoying greater flexibility in their port activities. Records from the Liverpool Maritime Museum indicate that typical merchant crew members could expect shore leave ranging from 12 hours to 4 days, depending on the duration of cargo operations and the captain's assessment of crew behavior during the voyage. However, these privileges came with strictly enforced conditions that reflected both practical concerns about crew retention and moral considerations prevalent in Victorian maritime culture. The process of obtaining shore leave typically began with the ship's first mate conducting what was termed a liberty roster, which determined the order in which crew members would be permitted to go ashore. Maritime employment contracts from the 1850s reveal that this system prevented entire crews from abandoning ships simultaneously while ensuring that sufficient personnel remained aboard to handle emergency situations or unexpected departure requirements. Experienced sailors understood that their position on the Liberty roster often reflected their standing with the ship's officers and their reputation for reliability in previous port calls. Port authorities in major trading centers maintained detailed regulations governing sailor conduct during shore leave periods. The Harbour Master's office in Boston, according to documentation from 1844, required all foreign sailors to register their intended accommodations and provide estimated return times to their vessels. These requirements emerged from concerns about desertion, which represented a persistent problem for ship captains who faced the prospect of recruiting replacement crew members in foreign ports at considerably higher wages than those established in their home ports. The phenomenon of sailor desertion reached particularly problematic levels in certain ports during specific periods of the 19th century. Records from San Francisco during the California Gold Rush, specifically between 1849 and 1855, indicate that some merchant vessels lost between 40 and 60% of their crews to the lure of gold prospecting. Ship captains responded to these challenges by implementing increasingly restrictive shore leave policies, including the practice of retaining sailors' personal belongings aboard ship and requiring monetary deposits that will be forfeited in cases of desertion. The types of establishments that catered to sailors during their shore leave reflected both their limited financial resources and their desire for activities unavailable during long ocean voyages. Port districts in major cities developed distinct characteristics designed to accommodate maritime workers' specific needs and preferences. The Sailortown area of Liverpool, which flourished throughout the mid-19th century, contained approximately 47 boarding houses specifically licensed to accommodate merchant sailors, along with numerous taverns, provision shops, and recreational establishments. These boarding houses, known colloquially as sailors' hotels, operated under licensing systems that required proprietors to maintain detailed records of their guests and report any suspicious activities to port authorities. Municipal records from Portsmouth indicate that licensed boarding house operators charged sailors between 1 shilling 6pence and 3 shillings per night, depending on the quality of accommodations and the inclusion of meals. These establishments also provided essential services such as laundry facilities, letter-writing assistance for illiterate crew members, and secure storage for personal valuables. The relationship between boarding house operators and sailors involved complex networks of credit and mutual obligation. Many proprietors advanced money to sailors against their expected wages, charged reasonable rates for extended stays between voyages, and maintained informal employment networks that helped experienced sailors find positions on outbound vessels. However, some establishments operated less scrupulously, employing tactics designed to separate sailors from their accumulated wages through overpriced services, gambling operations, or artificially inflated charges for room and board. Shore leave activities varied considerably depending on the cultural context of specific ports and the length of time vessels remained in harbour. In Mediterranean ports such as Gibraltar or Malta, where British naval and merchant vessels frequently called during the mid-19th century, sailors typically sought accommodations that provided access to local markets for purchasing personal supplies, tropical fruits unavailable during ocean voyages, and textiles or crafted goods that might serve as gifts for family members upon their return to Britain. The purchasing power of sailor wages in foreign ports created opportunities for commerce that influenced local economies in measurable ways. Economic historians examining trade patterns in Caribbean ports during the 1860s have determined that British sailors' spending on personal items, entertainment, and local services contributed approximately 15% of total foreign currency earnings in ports such as Kingston, Jamaica, and Bridgetown, Barbados. This economic impact encouraged local governments to maintain favourable policies toward British maritime workers while implementing sufficient regulation to prevent serious social disruption. Religious and moral reform movements of the 19th century significantly influenced shore leave policies and the types of establishments available to sailors in many ports. The Sailors' Rest movement, initiated by organizations such as the British and Foreign Sailors' Society in 1837, established alternative accommodations designed to provide wholesome recreational activities and moral guidance for maritime workers. These facilities, located in major ports including London, Cardiff, and Newcastle, offered reading rooms, letter-writing materials, educational lectures, and alcohol-free social gathering spaces. The effectiveness of these moral reform initiatives varied considerably, depending on their proximity to traditional sailor entertainment districts and their ability to provide services at competitive prices. Records from the Sailors' Rest Facility in Hamburg, established in 1852 to serve British crews trading in Baltic ports, indicate that the institution accommodated an average of 180 sailors per month during peak trading seasons. However, informal surveys conducted by maritime missionaries suggested that these reformed establishments attracted primarily older, married sailors, while younger crew members continued to frequent traditional boarding houses and taverns. Shore leave procedures also encompassed practical considerations related to crew health and medical care. Port cities maintained medical facilities specifically designed to treat conditions common among maritime workers, including scurvy, various tropical diseases, and injuries sustained during ocean voyages. The Royal Naval Hospital at Plymouth, which also treated merchant sailors during the mid-19th century, maintained detailed records indicating that approximately 35% of treated maritime workers suffered from nutritional deficiencies, while 28% required treatment for injuries sustained during cargo handling operations. Medical examinations during shore leave sometimes revealed conditions that prevented sailors from continuing their voyages, creating complex legal and financial obligations for ship owners and crew members alike. Maritime law during this period generally required ship owners to provide basic medical care for injured crew members, but the extent of these obligations remained subject to considerable interpretation. Sailors who became incapacitated in foreign ports face particularly difficult circumstances, as they might be discharged from their vessels without sufficient resources to secure passage home or obtain extended medical treatment. The administrative aspects of shore leave included careful documentation of crew movements and activities, particularly in ports where political tensions or security concerns required enhanced surveillance of foreign nationals. British consular offices in Mediterranean and Caribbean ports maintained registers of British sailors present in their jurisdictions, partly to assist with legal matters or repatriation needs, but also to monitor potential security risks associated with maritime workers who might possess detailed knowledge of naval installations, shipping routes, or cargo manifests. These documentation requirements occasionally created bureaucratic complications that extended planned shore leave periods beyond their intended duration. Consular records from Alexandria, Egypt, dating from 1863, describe situations where British merchant sailors experienced delays of up to 10 days, while officials verified their credentials and confirmed their authorization to travel in Egyptian territory. Such delays imposed additional expenses on both crew members and ship owners, while potentially disrupting carefully planned sailing schedules that depended on favorable seasonal conditions or specific cargo delivery requirements. These administrative complications form just one component of the broader economic pressures that shaped maritime labor practices throughout the 19th century. The fundamental structure of sailor compensation remained rooted in systems that had evolved over centuries. Yet the industrial transformation of global shipping created new tensions between traditional wage arrangements and the changing demands of maritime commerce. Records from the British Board of Trade, compiled systematically beginning in 1835, reveal that merchant sailors typically received monthly wages ranging from 18 to 35 shillings, depending on their rank, experience, and the specific trade routes their vessels served. The wage structure aboard merchant vessels followed a rigid hierarchy that reflected both skill levels and responsibilities. Ordinary seamen, who comprised the largest portion of most crews, earned between 18 and 22 shillings per month during the 1840s and 1850s. Able seamen, distinguished by their demonstrated competency in navigation, rigging work, and general seamanship, commanded wages of 24 to 28 shillings monthly. Skilled positions such as carpenter, cook, or boatswain typically earned 30 to 35 shillings, while officers received substantially higher compensation that often included additional privileges regarding food, accommodation, and shore leave arrangements. However, these nominal wage figures provide an incomplete picture of actual sailor earnings, as maritime labor practices incorporated numerous deductions and conditional payments that significantly affected take-home compensation. Ship owners routinely deducted costs for clothing, medical care, tobacco, and other supplies purchased during voyages. The practice of dead horse, whereby sailors received advance payments before departure that were then deducted from subsequent wages, meant that many crew members earned no actual cash during the first weeks or even months of their voyages. Admiralty records from 1847 indicate that these advance payments typically ranged from 2 to 6 weeks' wages, creating a system of debt that bound sailors to their vessels and limited their flexibility to seek alternative employment. The timing and method of wage payments created additional complications for maritime workers. Unlike shore-based laborers who might receive weekly or bi-weekly compensation, sailors typically receive payment only at the conclusion of their voyages, which could extend for months or even years, depending on trade routes and cargo requirements. This system placed sailors in vulnerable positions, particularly when disputes arose regarding working conditions, food quality, or treatment by officers. Documentation from the London Shipping Office, established in 1844 to regulate maritime employment practices, describes cases where sailors forfeited months of accumulated wages due to charges of insubordination, desertion, or violation of ship's articles. The Articles of Agreement standardized legal documents that govern the relationship between ship owners and crew members, established working conditions that would be considered exceptionally harsh by contemporary standards. These agreements, which became mandatory for British vessels following the Merchant Shipping Act of 1854, specified work schedules that typically required sailors to remain on duty for 4-hour watches throughout each 24-hour period, with brief intervals for meals and essential maintenance tasks. The concept of regular days off or leisure time simply did not exist within maritime labor practices, as the operational requirements of sailing vessels demanded continuous attention to weather conditions, sail management, and navigation duties. Food provisions, while specified in ship's articles, often became sources of significant tension between crew members and ship owners. Standard rations typically included salt pork or beef, hardtack biscuits, dried peas or beans, and small quantities of butter, cheese, and molasses. However, the quality and quantity of these provisions frequently fell short of contractual obligations, particularly on longer voyages where spoilage and pest infestation compromised food stores. The timber trade between Baltic ports and Britain, for example, operated primarily during spring and summer months, when ice conditions permitted safe navigation in northern waters. Sailors specializing in this trade might earn steady wages for 6 to 8 months annually, then face extended periods without income during winter months when Baltic shipping ceased operations. Port records from Stockholm and Riga during the 1850s indicate that experienced sailors in the timber trade earned approximately 30% higher monthly wages than their counterparts in year-round trades, but their annual earnings often proved comparable due to seasonal unemployment periods. The emergence of steam-powered vessels during the middle decades of the 19th century began to create new categories of maritime labor that required different skills and commanded different wage structures. Engine room personnel, including firemen, coal trimmers, and engineers, earned wages that reflected both the specialized knowledge required for steam operations and the particularly harsh working conditions in machinery spaces. Firemen, responsible for maintaining steam pressure through continuous coal feeding, typically earned 25 to 30 shillings monthly, while qualified engineers commanded wages of 40 to 60 shillings, reflecting their essential role in vessel operations and the technical expertise required for steam engine maintenance and repair. However, the transition from sail to steam power occurred gradually throughout the 19th century, and sailing vessels continued to dominate many trade routes well into the 1880s and beyond. This technological evolution, while transforming operational aspects of maritime service, did little to alter the fundamental structures of naval discipline that had governed shipboard life for centuries. Whether powered by wind or steam, vessels at sea remained isolated communities where order depended entirely upon the absolute authority of commanding officers and the swift enforcement of established codes of conduct. The foundation of 19th century naval discipline rested upon the Articles of War, which in the British Royal Navy had been codified and refined through successive parliamentary acts dating back to 1661. The version that governed most of the century, enacted in 1749 and amended in 1866, contained 36 articles that detailed specific offences and their corresponding punishments. These regulations served as the maritime equivalent of civil law, though with considerably harsher penalties, reflecting the unique challenges of maintaining order in the confined and dangerous environment of a sailing vessel. Naval discipline protocols varied significantly between different maritime powers, though certain fundamental principles remained consistent across national boundaries. The French Marine Nationale operated under the Code disciplinaire et pénal de la marine marchande, established in 1852 under Napoleon III, while the United States Navy followed regulations codified in 1800 and substantially revised in 1862 following experiences during the Civil War period. German naval forces, particularly after unification in 1871, adopted disciplinary codes heavily influenced by Prussian military traditions, emphasizing rigid hierarchical structures and immediate compliance with superior orders. The severity of punishments prescribed under these various naval codes reflected the widespread belief among maritime authorities that harsh discipline served as the most effective deterrent to misconduct aboard ship. Flogging remained the most common corporal punishment throughout the first half of the 19th century, administered with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip consisting of 9 knotted cords attached to a rope handle. The number of lashes varied according to the severity of the offense, with minor infractions such as disrespectful language or neglect of duty typically resulting in 12 to 24 lashes, while more serious offences like striking a superior officer could warrant 50 to 100 lashes. Records from the British Admiralty indicate that between 1830 and 1840, approximately 60% of Royal Navy vessels reported at least one flogging incident during typical 6-month voyages, with larger ships of the line averaging between 15 and 20 flogging incidents per cruise. The Portsmouth Naval Hospital maintained detailed logs of injuries resulting from corporal punishment, noting that complications from severe flogging included permanent scarring, infection of lacerated tissue, and in extreme cases, fatalities from blood loss or subsequent sepsis. The process of administering flogging followed strict ceremonial protocols designed to maximize its deterrent effect upon the crew. The condemned sailor would be summoned to appear before the assembled company, typically on the main deck during morning watch around 8 o'clock. The ship's articles of war would be read aloud, followed by a formal statement of charges and the prescribed punishment. The offender would then be secured to a wooden grating, usually positioned near the mainmast, with arms extended and wrists bound with rope. The actual flogging was performed by the ship's boatswain, or in his absence by a boatswain's mate, using the regulation cat-o'-nine tails kept specifically for disciplinary purposes. Each lash was administered with deliberate spacing, allowing approximately 10 seconds between strikes to ensure maximum psychological impact. The ship's surgeon was required to be present during all flogging procedures, with authority to halt the punishment if the condemned sailor appeared to be in immediate mortal danger, though such interventions were relatively rare according to surviving disciplinary logs. Progressive reform movements throughout the 19th century gradually challenged the continued use of corporal punishment in naval services. The British Parliament conducted extensive hearings on naval discipline between 1847 and 1849, receiving testimony from serving officers, former sailors, and medical personnel regarding the effectiveness and humanitarian implications of flogging. Captain Christopher Claxton, testifying before the Parliamentary Committee on Naval Discipline in 1848, argued that flogging had become counterproductive, stating that it degraded the moral character of both the punished sailor and the crew forced to witness the procedure. Similar reform discussions occurred in other maritime nations during the same period. The United States Navy officially abolished flogging in 1850, following congressional legislation sponsored by Senator John Parker Hale of New Hampshire, who had served briefly in the Merchant Marine during his youth. The French Marine Nationale substantially reduced the use of corporal punishment following regulations issued in 1857, though it was not completely eliminated until 1881. The British Royal Navy maintained flogging for serious offences until 1879, when it was finally abolished, except in cases of mutiny or violent assault upon superior officers. Alternative punishments that gained prominence as corporal punishment declined included reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, confinement in the ship's brig, and various forms of extra duty assignments. Stoppage of grog, the daily rum ration that formed an important component of naval life, served as a particularly effective deterrent for minor infractions. Records indicate that between 1860 and 1880, approximately 40% of disciplinary actions in the Royal Navy involved temporary or permanent suspension of alcohol privileges, often combined with additional duties such as holystoning decks or cleaning the ship's head facilities. Confinement protocols varied considerably depending upon the vessel's size and configuration. Larger warships typically maintained dedicated brig facilities in the lower decks, consisting of small compartments secured with iron bars and equipped with basic sleeping accommodations. Smaller vessels often improvise confinement spaces using cleared sections of the hold or convert in unused storage compartments for temporary detention purposes. Records from the USS Constitution indicate that during the War of 1812, ship's surgeon Amos Evans conducted 17 amputations during a single engagement, with approximately half of the patients surviving the procedure and subsequent recovery period. The absence of anesthesia, which would not become widely available until the 1840s, meant that such operations required physical restraint of conscious patients, often assisted by several crew members and substantial quantities of rum or whiskey for pain management. Infectious diseases spread rapidly in the crowded, poorly ventilated conditions typical of early 19th century vessels. Typhus, carried by body lice that thrived in unwashed clothing and bedding, periodically swept through entire crews, with mortality rates exceeding 50% among affected individuals. Yellow fever, encountered primarily in tropical ports of the Caribbean and West Africa, proved equally devastating to European and American sailors who lacked natural immunity to the disease. Naval medical records from the 1830s document numerous instances of ships losing more than half their complement to fever during single voyages, with replacement crews frequently succumbing to the same conditions upon arrival in infected ports. The practice of quarantine, though not yet based upon modern understanding of disease transmission, provided some protection against the spread of epidemic illnesses between ships and shore communities. Port authorities in major naval bases, including Portsmouth, Gibraltar, and Malta, maintained quarantine stations where vessels displaying signs of infectious disease could be isolated for observation periods, typically lasting 2 to 3 weeks. During such quarantines, affected ships remained anchored in designated areas, while medical officials monitored the health of crew members and fumigated living spaces using smoke from burning sulfur, vinegar, and aromatic herbs. These procedures, while not scientifically effective against bacterial or viral infections, occasionally provided sufficient time for epidemics to run their course before ships returned to active service. Dental problems plagued sailors throughout the 19th century, as ship stores typically consisted primarily of preserved foods high in sugar and salt, but lacking in nutrients necessary for maintaining healthy teeth and gums. Hardtack, the standard naval biscuit, became so rock-hard during extended storage that sailors often soaked it in water or coffee to make it edible, leading to increased bacterial growth and dental decay. Few ships carried personnel with any dental training, leaving crew members to extract their own damaged teeth using whatever tools were available, typically without any form of pain relief beyond alcohol consumption. By the 1850s, many career naval personnel had lost most or all of their natural teeth before reaching 40 years of age. Mental health concerns, though not recognized as medical conditions requiring treatment, manifested frequently among sailors subjected to prolonged isolation, monotonous routines, and constant physical danger. Naval regulations typically classified symptoms of what modern medicine would recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress as disciplinary problems requiring punishment rather than medical intervention. However, some enlightened ship surgeons began documenting patterns of behavioral changes among crew members during extended voyages, noting connections between dietary deficiencies, lack of sleep, and deteriorating mental condition. Dr. Thomas Trotter, physician to the Royal Navy Fleet during the early 1800s, published observations suggesting that many cases of apparent insubordination or cowardice actually resulted from physical exhaustion and malnutrition rather than character defects. The gradual improvement in shipboard medical practices during the middle decades of the 19th century reflected broader advances in scientific understanding and medical education occurring throughout European and American societies. The establishment of formal naval medical schools, including the Royal Naval Medical School at Haslar Hospital, beginning in 1832, provided more systematic training for maritime medical officers. The mechanics of mail delivery to and from vessels at sea relied heavily on a system known as speaking or gamming, wherein ships would approach each other on the open ocean for the express purpose of exchanging information, supplies, and correspondence. Captain's logs from the period indicate that these encounters were carefully orchestrated affairs, with established protocols governing how vessels would signal their intention to communicate. The International Maritime Signal Code, which began to be standardized in the 1850s following proposals by Captain Frederick Marriott, provided ships with a common language of flag combinations that could convey basic information about nationality, destination, and requests for communication. Records from the American whaling industry demonstrate that mail transfer between vessels occurred with remarkable frequency in certain heavily traveled oceanic regions. The Azores, positioned strategically in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, served as an informal postal hub where homeward-bound vessels would collect accumulated correspondence from ships continuing their voyages. Portuguese authorities in the Azores maintained unofficial registries of American whaling vessels and their approximate positions, allowing captains to deposit mail with reasonable confidence that it would eventually reach vessels bound for New Bedford or other New England ports. The establishment of formal mail packet services during the early 19th century revolutionized communication possibilities for merchant sailors, though these services remained expensive and irregular. The Black Ball Line, founded in 1818, was among the first to offer scheduled transatlantic passenger and mail service between New York and Liverpool, maintaining departures on specific dates regardless of weather conditions. This reliability, previously unknown in oceanic shipping, created opportunities for maritime workers to arrange predetermined mail exchanges at major ports. Similar packet services were established on other routes, including the Red Star Line serving Philadelphia and Liverpool, beginning in 1822, and various companies operating between Boston and European ports throughout the 1820s and 1830s. The challenges of preserving correspondence aboard sailing vessels were considerable, particularly during extended voyages through tropical climates where humidity and temperature fluctuations could rapidly deteriorate paper and ink. Sailors developed various techniques for protecting their letters and journals, often wrapping them in oiled cloth or storing them within waterproof containers improvised from available materials. The letters of William Torrey, an ordinary seaman aboard the whaling ship Lagoda during its 1841 to 1845 Pacific voyage, provide detailed descriptions of how crew members would seal their correspondence using melted candle wax and store the letters within hollowed sections of wooden spars to protect them from moisture and vermin. Naval communication systems of the 19th century operated under significantly different constraints and protocols compared to those governing merchant vessels. The Royal Navy maintained an extensive network of signal stations throughout the British Empire, staffed by personnel trained in the rapid transmission of coded messages using flag systems, semaphore arrangements, and later in the century, telegraph equipment. These shore-based installations, many of which were constructed during the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815, could relay information about ship movements, enemy activity, and urgent communications across considerable distances in a matter of hours, rather than weeks. The development of standardized naval signal codes represented a significant advancement in maritime communication efficiency during this period. The system devised by Admiral Sir Homeriggs Popham, first published in 1800 and subsequently revised multiple times through the 1840s, assigned numerical values to common words and phrases used in naval operations. This telegraphic code allowed complex messages to be transmitted using relatively simple flag combinations, dramatically reducing the time required for ship-to-ship communication. Advancement to commissioned officer ranks remained exceptionally rare for sailors who began their careers in the forecastle, though historical documentation indicates that such promotions occasionally occurred under extraordinary circumstances. The position of third mate represented the lowest commissioned officer rank, requiring demonstrated navigation skills, knowledge of maritime law, and the ability to maintain accurate logbooks and cargo records. Shipping company records from the transatlantic packet trade during the 1840s suggest that third mates earned monthly salaries of approximately $80 to $100, along with officers' quarters and enhanced meal privileges. The role of second mate demanded additional expertise in crew management, cargo handling supervision, and advanced navigation techniques, including celestial navigation using sextant and chronometer. Contemporary maritime documents indicate that second mates typically assumed responsibility for specific watch periods and often served as intermediaries between the captain and crew members during disputes or disciplinary matters. Records from the California Gold Rush shipping trade suggest that experienced second mates could negotiate salaries ranging from $120 to $150 monthly, representing substantial financial advancement compared to common seaman wages. First mate positions required comprehensive maritime expertise, including advanced seamanship, navigation, crew management, and commercial knowledge related to cargo operations and port procedures. The first mate traditionally served as the captain's primary deputy and assumed command responsibilities during the captain's absence or incapacitation. Maritime employment records from the 1850s indicate that first mates on major shipping routes earned salaries ranging from $150 to $250 monthly. along with profit-sharing arrangements on certain merchant voyages. Captaincy represented the ultimate career achievement for professional mariners, though attaining such rank typically required not only exceptional maritime skills but also substantial financial resources for vessel ownership or significant social connections within shipping company hierarchies. Records suggest that most merchant captains during the mid-19th century had pursued maritime careers for 20 to 25 years before achieving command positions. The financial rewards of captaincy varied considerably depending upon trade routes and vessel types, with transatlantic packet captains earning annual salaries of approximately $3,000 to $5,000 during the 1840s. However, historians note that the majority of career sailors never advanced beyond able seaman or petty officer ranks, spending decades performing essentially similar duties aboard various vessels throughout their working lives. Maritime pension records from British shipping companies indicate that the average career sailor worked approximately 25 to 30 years before age-related physical limitations forced retirement from active sea duty. The physical demands of maritime labor, including exposure to harsh weather conditions, repetitive manual tasks, and limited medical care during extended voyages, often resulted in premature aging and chronic health conditions. Retirement planning for 19th century sailors presented significant challenges, as few shipping companies or governments provided systematic pension programs for maritime workers. British naval personnel could access Greenwich Hospital pension benefits after 21 years of service, providing monthly payments of approximately 10 to 15 shillings, along with medical care and housing assistance. However, merchant sailors typically relied upon personal savings, family support, or charitable organizations for retirement security. Many aging sailors sought employment in shore-based maritime occupations, including dock work, warehouse supervision, or positions with customs authorities which utilized their accumulated maritime knowledge while reducing physical demands. Port records from Liverpool, London, and Bristol during the 1850s indicate that approximately 40% of dock supervisors and cargo inspectors were former seamen with extensive ocean-going experience. These positions typically provided modest but steady income of 12 to 18 shillings weekly, along with the social benefits of regular community contact after decades of isolation aboard ships. Some retired sailors established small businesses related to maritime trades, including rope-making, sail repair, or provisioning services for departing vessels. Contemporary business directories from major port cities suggest that former mariners operated approximately 15% of ship chandlery establishments, utilizing their practical knowledge of shipboard requirements to serve the maritime community. These enterprises provided modest incomes while allowing retired sailors to maintain connections with active seafaring life. The establishment of seamen's charitable organizations during the middle decades of the 19th century provided additional support systems for aging maritime workers. The American Seamen's Friend Society, founded in 1826, operated boarding houses and provided financial assistance to retired sailors in major port cities. Similar organizations in British ports offered comparable services, including the Sailors' Home Movement, which provided affordable accommodation and social support for former mariners. Records indicate that many sailors maintained informal networks of mutual support, sharing resources and information about employment opportunities or retirement accommodations. These relationships, forged during years of shared hardship aboard ships, often provided crucial assistance during the transition from active seafaring to retirement. Historians believe that such networks represented important social structures within maritime communities. The gradual introduction of steam propulsion and changing maritime technologies during the 1850s created both opportunities and challenges for aging sailors. Some career mariners successfully adapted to steam vessel operations, while others found their traditional skills less relevant to modern shipping requirements. Contemporary employment records suggest that older sailors often concentrated in sailing ship trades, which continued operating alongside steam vessels throughout the remainder of the century. Ultimately, the career progression available to 19th century sailors reflected broader social and economic structures of the period. Most maritime workers experienced modest advancement opportunities while facing significant challenges related to job security and retirement planning. Their contributions to global commerce and maritime tradition established foundations for future developments in seafaring professions. The lives of these sailors slowly faded into the gentle rhythm of waves against distant shores. Their stories became whispers carried on ocean winds. Time moved like tides. Their voices grew soft, distant, quiet now. The sea remembers, always remembers. Soft waves, gentle, fading into silence. Thank you for studying with the Sleep Scholar. May your dreams be filled with quiet knowledge. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next lesson.